Shalom, and welcome to What the Watchman Sees, a ministry that will sift through all of the social media noise to show you news of importance from the Most High's perspective. As watchmen, we are here both to warn of dangers and give biblical answers for dwelling in the secret place of the Most High during these times of confusion. Tell your family and friends to like, share, and subscribe as we delve into what Yahweh has for us, the apple of His eye. Let's get to work. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We're going to look at this meditation. We're going to do this meditation looking at the foundation for the biblical examples of this initiative called Project 2025. It actually becomes the latest iteration of a cultural and religious and spiritual reality that this country has been in since its inception. I know that everyone is used to being ahistorical when it comes to how we deal with various aspects of political or social movement in this country, but the scriptures have given us the ability to see things from the Most High's perspectives in all things, actually, and this being no exception. So we're going to be looking at a presentation that was done, see what the Father has for us to understand. So let's get started. Project 2025 needs to be seen in its historical and spiritual context. The purpose of this Shabbat meditation is to look at the origins of Project 2025. Project 2025 is a manifestation of the real spiritual condition that this country has been dealing with since its inception. So that's what this presentation is going to be looking at. For every cultural phenomena, there is a spiritual base for it. We indeed are spiritual beings having a experience in our fleshly bodies. So with that in mind, let's look at our guiding biblical passages and principles that we'll be dealing with. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, you've heard Deuteronomy chapter 28, the first 14 verses are the Most High telling His people that if His people do His will and follow His commandments, then the blessings of doing so are going to be numerous. And so for those first 14 verses, He gives the equivalent of the blessings that come from doing the will of the Most High. And then He says, starting at verse 15, but if you choose not to do that, there are curses that go with not doing that. And so the blessings are the positive consequences. The curses are the negative consequences. Now, the blessings, had they been moved with, would far outweigh in the souls of the people, in the heart and the soul of the people, that which would have been curses should they choose not to. But the children of Israel chose the latter rather than the former. So for the next verses, from verse 15 up through verse 68, those verses represent the result of that which would happen to the Most High's people should they choose not to follow Him. And so in verse 68, the very last verse, it says, and Yahuwah shall bring you into Egypt again with ships by the way whereof I spoke to you. You shall see it no more, it being the land of promise. And there shall you be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you, or no man shall redeem you. So the culmination of the curse that accrued to the people of the Most High is in verse 68. Now, as we have been saying, this is a cyclical phenomenon. It does happen, and there are instances where it happens, but it happens more than once. So this is actually a state of being when a soul or a group of people either choose to follow the Most High or choose not to follow the Most High. So that's what Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68 says. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 and 2, it says, "And it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse," see, they both happen to the children of Israel, "which I have set before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations where Yahuwah your Elohim has driven you, and shall return to Yahuwah your Elohim, and shall obey his voice, according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul. Then Yahuwah your Elohim will turn your captivity, turn it around, and have compassion on you, and will return and gather you from all the nations where Yahuwah your Elohim has scattered you." So that's a part of the promise as well. And then in verse 7, it says, "And Yahuwah your Elohim will put all these curses upon your enemies and on them that hate you, which persecuted you. And you shall return and obey the voice of Yahuwah and do all his commandments, which I command you this day." And then in Obadiah has one chapter, and verse 18, Obadiah is referring, it's a whole book written to the children of Jacob's twin brother, those who belong to the line of Esau, whose name was changed to Edom. So this is a book written to the Edomites. And in verse 18, it says, "Then the house of Jacob will be a blazing fire, and the house of Joseph a burning flame, but the house of Esau will be stubble, and Jacob will set it ablaze and consume it. Therefore no survivor will remain from the house of Esau." Esau and Jacob were the twin brothers twin sons of Isaac, and one received the blessing, the other one received a blessing, but not the blessing of the firstborn. That was given to Jacob. We all know that story. I'm not going to rehearse it, but that story plays itself out from the time the twins are in the womb till 2025, and it's still playing itself out today. Okay, so in Obadiah verse 18, it says, "The house of Jacob will be a blazing fire, and the house of Joseph a burning flame, but the house of Esau will be stubble, and Jacob will set it ablaze and consume it. Therefore no survivor will remain from the house of Esau." Those scriptures are three scriptures that specifically speak to the twins, Esau and Jacob, and their progeny, as the spiritual contest plays itself out. And so part of this presentation is to give us an understanding of what that looks like specifically for our people in 2025. This is, again, a message to Yasharel. Okay, Project 2025 comes in modern time as a part of American conservatism. It's a cultural and political thread that can also be found in the roots of the Heritage Foundation. So the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 have the same focus. This goes back to the founding era of this nation, 1776 to 1789. The American conservatism focus has been, from the founding of the country, natural rights as described by the founders. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Limited government, federalism, suspicion of centralized authority. In those first 13 colonies, their focus was on a confederation that would keep the power and authority in the states, and that the federal system would be more of a coordinator. So those states, from the foundation of the nation, had to do with states' rights. When they said states' rights, the states that were talking about the rights, it was the right to make money by any means appropriate as the states and those who ran the states saw them. This was the 19th century during the 1800s. Then, when we go into the 1900s, the American conservatism also found itself in opposition to progressive thought, which would lead to a larger middle class in this country, because the progression of the society was such that the robber barons, if you will, the people with the money and the power could not make all of the money and use their power to continue to do that. And that's where the labor unions came from. It was out of that progressive idea. It was then taken by the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s. Even then, classical American conservatism was in direct opposition to that. So the whole idea of progressiveness has always been anathema to classical American conservatism, specifically the New Deal. There are still parts of the New Deal that are under attack in 2025 because of this. And so all of those conflicts between so-called liberals and so-called conservatives had to do with who has the power to make decisions for other people. Again, in the founding of the nation, or was concentrated into a handful of rich people. And it was always seen by those people to be the government's job to do what they instructed to be done. And this whole idea of a progressive focus, which potentially had the capability of meeting ordinary people's needs, then driven from the elite, that's been the continual conflict. So 1945 through 1974, all that dynamic was in play. Then we look at fusionism, the strong national defense, backlash to social liberalization. That's where the Heritage Foundation began to take root. It was conceived and financed by the elite and marketed as a plan for the middle class. It was from that group of wealthy businessmen and landowners then that the idea of pro-capitalism, they locked on to pro-family, anti-bureaucracy, anti-communism. All of those things were a part of what we call classical American conservatism. Now, there's a thread that has gone through American culture since the inception of the country. So we're going to be spending some time on that. I asked a question through AI about how this affects the lives of people of African descent. What has been our relationship in this larger society to the rules, the laws, the legislation that are relative to either our oppression or our being able to be free from oppression in this country that claims that it is a Christian nation. So it started with the Revolutionary era up to the early Republic, the 1776 to the 1820. So in this Christian republic, as people are claiming it to be, the promotion of ways the society can deal with its African descended population found its way in the northern states, beginning to abolish slavery. And that started in the 1780s. Many northern states like Pennsylvania in 1780 and Massachusetts in 1783 passed gradual emancipation laws or abolishing slavery. So that was the positive part of the thread. The negative part of the thread was during that same period of time, the U.S. Constitution in 1787 recognized and protected slavery. And that's where the 3/5 compromise came in. That's where the fugitive slave clause came in. And the fugitive slave clause was directed at the North, not the South, because the slaves who had either bought their freedom or took their freedom and had found their way up north, there needed to be a way from the South's perspective to get those people back into slavery. So they had laws created that the North went along with. And that's where the 3/5 compromise came in. The fugitive slave clause came in. Basically, anyone could go up north and claim that a black man or a black woman was a fugitive slave. Whether they were or not is irrelevant. And they could drag them back or drag them to the places in the South that still needed free labor. In 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act was actually enacted, and it allowed, as I said, for the capture and return of a runaway of runaway or enslaved people, even in free states. So in the Revolutionary era, this was the state of people of African descent in the United States of America, this Christian nation. In the 1820s through 1860s, the antebellum period, the promotion, that's where the abolitionist movement became strong. There was increased advocacy for African American rights by abolitionists, which included people from the African American community, such as Frederick Douglass, but also many white clergy were affiliated with the abolitionist movement. And it should be mentioned that the abolitionist movement did not mean that the people who believed in abolition also believed that people of African descent were of the same social status as people who would be considered white, but they didn't believe in slavery. And then again, when it comes to the denial, the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not and could not be citizens of the United States. One of the reasons that we are looking at this history is because the United States has a history of doing this. So when you hear people talking about that in 2025, about people being able to have their citizenship taken, that is not new. That goes back to the 1800s. In the 1800s, the 1820s through 1860, black codes and disenfranchisement protocols were in place, especially in the southern states, where they restricted the freedoms of free black people and denied them legal protection. Everyone who was dark-skinned in the 1820s through the 1860s were not necessarily enslaved people, but if they lived in the South, that's how they were treated. Then we look at the Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 through 1877. There was the Emancipation Proclamation that everybody talks about, Lincoln freeing the slaves. Some historians believe that that was an act of prosecuting a war rather than an act of emancipation. The 14th Amendment in 1868 guaranteed citizenship and equal protection. Keep in mind, that's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870 prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Interestingly enough, this is the amendment that's being used now by people who are promoting Project 2025 to say that their rights, that they are being discriminated against, and we'll come back to that. The first Civil Rights Act occurred in 1866 and 1875, which guaranteed civil rights to freedmen. So those were hard-fought concessions that were found from 1861 to 1877. In denying those the ramifications, the positive ramifications for people of African descent. It was also the end of Reconstruction. What Reconstruction actually was, the federal government keeping a military presence in the South so that the South and the landowners in the South and the bankers in the South and the politicians in the South would not re-enslave the enslaved. So all of that ended in 1877 when Reconstruction ended. And simultaneous to that, that's when the rise of what we call Jim Crow laws began. The southern states enacted laws enforcing segregation and disenfranchising Black voters. There was a great deal of coordinated planning, strategic activity that took place to re-enslave those who had been enslaved up until the Civil War. And so, regardless of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts, all of that was neutralized, or most of it was neutralized by 1877. So that spirit that was leading these efforts at denial of basic human and civil rights to people of African descent was manifesting itself at that time. Then in the Jim Crow era from 1877 to the 1950s, that's nearly 100 years that the Jim Crow era existed. The NAACP was founded in 1909. One of the reasons it was founded had to do with how many people in the South, especially, were being lynched. And most of the people who were being lynched, which we don't know, that all of them were considered to be either rapists or thieves. Okay, that's how the lynchings were being promoted. But when you look at who was lynched, it was Black business people, Black farmers, primarily trying to protect their land and their businesses. And those who were doing well, those were the people who were lynched. That's what caused the NAACP to be founded in 1909. And it began challenging the whole segregation and disenfranchisement system through the court system. So there were several federal victories, like Gwynn versus the United States in 1915, which struck down the grandfather clauses used to prevent Black voting. I'm hoping that one can see that there has been a consistency in terms of advocacy for the needs of people of African descent that had to do with the voting booth, because that was the only remedy for the situation that Black people found themselves in. Because if you can vote for the right people, they can give you relief. That was the sense. And from the outset of the country, the landowners, the enslavers, the business class in the United States of America has always been on the other side. And I should mention, by this time, although it's not reflected in this presentation, the church was also in denial. So in the denial, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, which legalized racial segregation under separate but equal. The systematic disenfranchisement continued. When it comes to voting, there were literacy tests, there were poll taxes, and there were whites-only primaries. All of that designed to keep a people group disenfranchised from the political system. And in case people were able to slip through that, that's where the Ku Klux Klan became, and organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan became also prominent in a negative sense, spreading wide violence, racial violence, which included lynchings, it included race massacres. A lot of people refused to come to grips with the fact that race riots in the United States of America were overwhelmingly prosecuted by whites against people in the Black community, not vice versa. The whole notion of a race riot being associated with the Black community came as a result of the 60s, 1960s. But before that, almost all racially motivated riots were whites rioting against people in the Black community, which means that they came from their communities that were already segregated into the Black communities to destroy lives and property. And certainly the Tulsa riots were one of them, but those riots happened throughout the country, including St. Louis, East St. Louis, Springfield, Illinois. It included Atlanta. It included New York City, Boston. And that's how we know that this is a spirit that is ruling this land when it comes to that kind of activity. Then we get to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. So Brown versus the Board of Education, which declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. In my hometown, this ruling that happened in 1954 was resisted in a northern city until 1968. So that means that ruling was ignored in the city that I grew up until 1968, when they had no other choice. And then what they did was the same thing that was done in places like Virginia. They just were a little bit more devious in doing it. They closed all of the so-called segregated Black schools, took all of the best teachers out of the segregated Black schools, and put the best teachers in those schools in the white schools, and let the other teachers to fend for themselves. So even in my northern city, although Brown versus the Board of Education was the law, it was not functional at all until 1968. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was mirroring the Civil Rights Act of the 1800s. It was supposed to ban segregation and employment discrimination. See, all of these things are related. All of them have to do with money that those who are in the business community wanted to keep in their community. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited racial discrimination in voting. The Fair Housing Act was supposed to eliminate redlining, which redlining meant that Black people could only live and would only be given opportunities to live in certain parts of communities, the worst part. So the whole notion of a ghetto was not created by Black people. It was created for Black, by the business class, by the bank, by the people with money. And so the Fair Housing Act was an attempt, though meager, to mitigate that. Again, the denial, the resistance, and the backlash to all of those initiatives and acts were massive in the South. There was violence against people were killed trying to register to vote. This all happened in this so-called civil rights. And then at the local level, in every community that had significant numbers of people of African descent, there was local level obstruction in every sector, educationally, business-wide, housing, political endeavors. De facto segregation still persists, especially in northern cities, through redlining and housing discrimination. We used to say, or there was a saying among the community in the South, they don't care how close you get to them as long as you don't get too big. In the North, they didn't care how big you got as long as you didn't get too close. This was the reality of people of African descent in the civil rights movement. And I'll ask you to ask the question, where were the promoters of Project 2025 during this time. Which side were they on? In the post-civil rights era, the 70s through the 90s, the promotion was affirmative action, which, by the way, was promoted by the Nixon administration. And there were policies aimed at addressing historical racial discrimination in education and employment. Both of those things. There was an extension of the Voting Rights Act of 75 and 82, which strengthened protection for minority voters, because from the outset of voting, especially in the southern states, but also in the states in states where there were significant numbers of residents of African descent, there has always been a problem with voting and having your votes counted. People lost their lives literally trying to register to vote, trying to exercise their rights to vote. And the lower classes of the white community were those who were used to make sure that life was made miserable for those people who wanted to exercise those rights to vote. Why was the right to vote so important? Because that was one of the few places where the playing field could be leveled enough in order for the needs of a community that was targeted for unjust treatment to get some relief. Any of the political and social efforts made by those who were of African descent always had to do with trying to get basic human needs met. And again, every time the denial was strong as, if not stronger than, the promotion. So anti-affirmative action rulings by the Supreme Court under the guise of its discriminatory nature. This is what we were talking about earlier. Using the very laws that were enacted to protect people of African descent from a discriminatory system, now being used to pretend that they were the ones causing the discrimination. And the Supreme Court saying, yes, that is the fact. A Black Supreme Court judge being one of the primary people who endorsed that lie. Former slave state voter suppression legislation under the guise of voter fraud correction. There's the voting piece again. Anti-DEI executive orders and legislation designed to recontrol the narrative of America without the stain and legacy of the genocide of one people and the involuntary servitude of another. All these things happening simultaneously. For every action meant to address the problem, there was an opposite reaction to try to keep the status quo. So what does all of this look like in a chart? And this is why this particular lesson is being given. Project 2025 is only the latest iteration of the promotion and denial of African American rights in U.S. history from 1776. Now this says up to 2010, but we can move it all the way up to 2025. So we see in green the promotion of rights, and in red, the denial. Wherever there's a green, there's a red. And in most cases, the red is longer than the green from the inception of the nation up to the present time. So the Northern abolition efforts were neutralized by the constitutional protection of slavery. The abolitionist movement was neutralized by the Dred Scott decision and black codes. The 13th through the 15th Amendments of the Civil Rights Acts were neutralized by the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow, which then led into Plessy versus Ferguson and a resegregation. The Civil Rights Movement legislation, affirmative action legislation, and protocols were also countered by mass incarceration, basically living while black. We used to call it walking while black, driving while black, eating while black. Anything that's done while black is liable to get you incarcerated. And if not incarcerated, just outright killed. Now, what's not mentioned on here is also in the social arena, drugs were introduced into the community. And I'll say that again, drugs were introduced into the community just as weapons were introduced into the community. So the combination of those two allowed for even greater mass incarceration. And then, although you can't see that last bit, it includes the music industry working with the prison industrial complex to produce among our children a culture of death. Those who would argue against this history now have said, if you teach this history, you're making our children not feel well, so you can't teach this. This very chart that you're looking at would be anathema to public education in its current form. So the point is, the pattern continues. Okay, so what has all that got to do with our lesson? The Most High's people are the people in question. All of these things are occurring because they target the people of the book. It's a spiritual condition that we are dealing with. There's the spirit of the Messiah, and there's the spirit of the Antichrist. The green represents how the Messiah works. The red represents how that which is against the Messiah and what the Messiah teaches, that is our current reality. So anytime you engage in a conversation, although that's going to be less and less of an issue, because in the public square, just talking about this can get you put in jail. And that's why the scriptures tell the prophets of the Most High to cry aloud and spare not. This has to be dealt with, or the Most High will deal with you. We are at the point in time when the Most High is about to step into history once again. When he does, this pattern that we have just seen in several slides and in several forms is going to be eliminated. The red will no longer be there. Right now, it doesn't seem that that is possible. And that's why we say it is the Most High's doing, and that's what makes it marvelous in our eyes. Because regardless of what this country says it is, its actions speak much louder than any platitudes and any historical writings that you may be able to patch together to make it seem like you are operating in the blessing of the Most High. The Most High is not pleased with this nation, and it's time for that to be said in no uncertain terms. You cannot call yourself by his name and lynch his people. You cannot call yourself by his name and send your armies into the communities of his people to destroy his people. You cannot be called by the Most High's name and send drugs and guns into the communities of his people so that they will destroy themselves. You cannot call yourself by his name claiming that you believe in pro-life for everybody but his people. Because when the children come out of the wombs of the women among his people, your first inclination, as Revelation chapter 12 says, is to kill the baby. So whether you wait to kill the baby before the womb or after the womb is irrelevant. Your intent is the same. Kill that child. Why? Because that child represents a new day, which is coming. And so, Yasharel, you are to help usher in that new day, but only if you want to. That's the meditation for this Shabbat. Father, bless you and keep you. Father, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Father, lift up his countenance upon you and give you his